All right, well, welcome Pennsylvania. Hello from Washington, D.C. I'm Jason Gross, Executive Director of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. It's great to join together today. Typically, this is the season where I'm traveling all over the country and getting to see you in person. I really miss that, but so glad we have the opportunity to connect this way today. First off, I sincerely hope that you and your families are safe and healthy. We're very pleased that we're going to be joined today by nearly 100 participants from Pennsylvania for this important discussion on America's role in the world in the midst of COVID-19 and why leading globally impacts us locally, living proof right now. This is an important conversation. We're honored to have Congresswoman Susan Wild with us, and we'll welcome her to the Zoom in just a minute. Why don't we start with some quick logistics? You're all on mute right now, but we do want to hear from you later. When I open up the Q&A, there are a couple ways to ask questions. On computers, I ask you to hit raise hand, and on the phone, you can dial *9 to join us, and I'll call on you. If you prefer to write, there's a Q&A box you'll see, and you can type your questions in there. First, why don't we start with a little bit about the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, who we are. This year, USGLC is proud to celebrate 25 years of building a better, safer world. We are over 500 businesses and humanitarian organizations alongside our network of business, faith, military, and community leaders from across the country. Our bipartisan National Advisory Council is chaired by Secretary Colin Powell, is made up of our nation's top security and foreign policy leaders, including most every living former Secretary of State. Our National Security Advisory Council is co-chaired by Admiral James Stavridis and General Tony Zinni, and is comprised of over 200 retired flag officers. Our Veterans for Smart Power initiative is made up of over 30,000 veterans from across the country who are committed to strengthening our non-military tools. And what brings us all together is a firm belief that we live in an interconnected world and that America needs to be engaged globally to advance our interests here at home. We talk about why a tiny 1% of the federal budget, called the International Affairs budget, is one of the most cost-effective and powerful investments America makes. It's sometimes called the foreign aid budget, but it's so much more than that. It funds our diplomats and embassies around the world and support for our key allies. It's our efforts to tackle global health threats, humanitarian disasters, impacts of climate change, and the root causes of terrorism. It's our work to combat corruption around the world, to promote the rule of law, advance democracy and universal rights and freedoms. And it's our programs that open up new markets for American exports of goods and services and public-private partnerships that are providing a hand up, not a handout, to millions around the globe. It's effective, it's accountable and transparent, and it delivers for the American people. We host forums like this with people all around the country, and we see that across political spectrums and state lines, Americans like you want to engage. COVID-19 has really underscored the importance of this fight, and we are so fortunate to be joined by an expert in Congress to help us discuss this today. Pleased to introduce our special guest, whom you all know well, Congresswoman Susan Wild. She's hard at work to address the challenge of the pandemic over the past few months and keep Pennsylvanians safe. Congresswoman Wild serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and has an important seat at the table when it comes to advancing America's global leadership, especially when it comes to tackling global health threats like the coronavirus. From her work in Congress to her travels overseas, she knows firsthand the values of investing in America's development and diplomacy programs. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us today. First off, most importantly, how are you and your family today?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. My family and I are doing well.
Good.
My 2 adult children who are in their mid-20s are home, came home at the end of March, expecting to be here for a couple of weeks. And here we are all these weeks later. So we are doing fine.
That's good to hear.
And I hope that all of you are as well.
I know you wanted to make some opening remarks to kick off our discussion, so please, the Zoom floor.
I would like to. First of all, I just want to thank you for this invitation. I've read up on the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. And I'm really just so impressed, not only by the people who are involved with it, but the mission of this organization. And it coalesces very nicely with my priorities in terms of foreign affairs. This is a time when the temptation could easily be to try to retreat from the rest of the world, and to become more isolationist, out of some sort of perhaps misguided idea that we would be safer if we were entirely isolated. But I think that it is becoming abundantly clear that this is a time for robust global engagement, and more of it rather than less of it than ever before. The speed of this virus and its global reach have reminded us of how extraordinarily interconnected our greatest challenges are, not just in terms of future pandemics or epidemics, but also climate change, nuclear proliferation, and war. I think this crisis has really exposed the dangers of the short-term zero-sum politics that have taken root in too many aspects of our foreign policy in recent years. By driving our closest allies away, time and again, we have weakened our own country's preparedness to deal with this kind of major global challenge. By undermining international institutions instead of working to improve and strengthen them, we have made it harder for these institutions to perform precisely at a time when we need them most. And by pitting our country against countries around the world, and even against states within our own borders, in a race to secure medical equipment, I think we've only succeeded in squandering some of our moral credibility. I think this is a time for unprecedented global cooperation, not nativism or factionalism. No country alone is going to be able to definitively contain this global pandemic. No country alone is going to be able to develop a global plan to prevent future infections from turning into this kind of threat. And no country alone is going to be able to get to a vaccine without unparalleled cooperation between scientists and research institutions around the world. I don't think we can fill this void on our own. And I am very proud of my colleagues on the Foreign Affairs Committee and throughout the House of Representatives who have worked together to advance a global strategy for our country. We're advocating for robust funding to assist developing countries because it's right, but also because their rate of success will ultimately dictate our rate of success. Within our own borders, we're addressing the needs of our colleges and universities, research institutions, and scientists so that our nation can contribute to the global search for solutions. Because our country must work with countries around the world to draw the lessons of this crisis. Several of us in the House have been pushing for a bipartisan commission on the coronavirus pandemic in the United States, which would be modeled after such bipartisan commissions that were established in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the September 11th attacks, and other major national and international crises. As several of my colleagues on the Foreign Affairs Committee and I, led by Chairman Engel, have urged the president directly to reverse the decision to cut funding for the World Health Organization. I don't believe these are Democratic or Republican priorities. The work that is done on our committee is so often bipartisan, and our priorities are often the same. They're national priorities. And just as Democrats and Republicans work together to mobilize our entire country in a common cause during and after unprecedented crises like World War II, we must rise to this occasion and bring our country together in this great shared effort of shouldering the burden and ultimately rebuilding. In the face of efforts to divide us, we have to demonstrate a unity of purpose. Across the globe, we see the new threats that this crisis is creating. Threats not just to public health, but alarmingly to fundamental rights and dignity. We see it in the disproportionate impact that this pandemic is having on women and girls around the world, rises in gender-based persecution and violence, girls who may never be able to return to the classroom and continue their education after having to leave, resources that are diverted from key areas across health systems like maternal health and family planning services, and the obligations and burdens of unpaid care, which systematically falls more heavily on women, girls, and their families, and which is increasing dramatically as a result of this pandemic. During this time, we've also been seeing authoritarian governments and democratically elected governments with authoritarian tendencies use this crisis as a pretext to ramp up repression of minorities, target dissidents, and further limit political freedom in their countries. We see examples of these trends in every corner of the globe. In Hungary, where the ruling party has enabled Prime Minister Orban to usurp the powers of parliament and target citizens and journalists who oppose him. We've seen it in Egypt, where new emergency legislation allows for dissidents and others to be detained indefinitely. We've seen it in Turkey, where President Erdogan is keeping political opponents in jail despite the risks to their health. And we've seen it in Uganda, where LGBTQ communities have been targeted. And of course in Brazil, where a xenophobic government continues to undermine the rights of remote indigenous communities, just as many of these communities are struggling to survive. And even in our own country, we are seeing continued attacks on the press from the highest levels of leadership at a time when maintaining the public's trust couldn't be more vital. But just as clearly, we are seeing many governments around the world descending into a deeper authoritarianism or retreating into a self-defeating nativism or xenophobia. And at the same time, we see citizens across the globe coming together around new, creative forms of shared purpose and solidarity. We see the potential for breakthroughs among the scientists that are working across borders. This is the hope that governments will follow the lead of their citizenries and that our shared humanity will win out in the end. Because whether it comes to this pandemic or other major challenges facing the international community, we do not need to resign ourselves and future generations to a future of decline, nor should we assure ourselves that progress is inevitable. The task of determining the path forward depends on us, all of us. The path of global cooperation might seem longer and harder than the path of narrow, short-sighted self-interest. But ultimately, only greater cooperation will allow us to shape our own tomorrow, rather than allowing it to be shaped for us by circumstances that have spiraled beyond our collective control. If we make the necessary commitments now and follow through on them, a different future, a more equitable, more secure, more peaceful, and more just future is possible and within our reach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. What a comprehensive start to our conversation today, which is going to focus on COVID-19 and America's role in the global response. And we'll discuss why it matters to our interests and values, that we address this pandemic threat both at home and abroad, as we just heard from the Congresswoman. Then we're going to open it up to some questions from your constituents. I want to kick things off with a quick video clip and get your reaction afterwards.
Okay.
Let's take a look at that clip.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
Congresswoman, so that was Bill Gates 5 years ago, warning us that we were not ready. And without a doubt, the world is still not ready today. 70% of the world remains unprepared to respond to a pandemic. 10 countries in Africa have no ventilators today. You are no stranger to these issues. You serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee and as vice chair of the subcommittee that oversees global health. So my question to you to kick this off is, as we address the urgent domestic challenges of the crisis, why is it essential to promote global health security, helping other countries prevent and respond to infectious disease threats?
Well, first, let me just say that it's remarkable how prescient Bill Gates' words were. I think it's really important for us to recognize that it's not just Bill Gates who was saying those kinds of things 5 years ago. Others are as well. And it's very easy when we're in a fairly healthy state to not think about these things and to feel as though we're always going to be okay. And modern medicine is pretty amazing. And people unfortunately often think that that means we can fix almost any medical problem and that we will be safe. I think that this pandemic has demonstrated so clearly how deeply interconnected we are with every country and its people. We are seeing clearly that the health of one country and its people can have a dramatic effect on the health of neighboring countries and even countries across the world. When we first started hearing about COVID-19, we were hearing about it in China. And I remember myself thinking, even as somebody very, very committed to global health and to foreign affairs, feeling as though it was so far away and that if it came here, we would have time to prepare. Well, we didn't. We saw how quickly it came. We know now, we've known for a long time, that the health of our neighboring countries and countries across the world affects our health. We've seen it with Ebola, we've seen it with AIDS, we've seen it throughout decades now. So during COVID-19, I'm happy that countries have been helping each other. They've been sharing medical information, they've been sharing healthcare best practices, and of course they've been sharing life-saving medical supplies. I think it's really important to recognize that scientists, by and large, are not guided by politics, they're not guided by boundaries. They are interested in the pursuit of science. And thank goodness for that. And we must help them. We must give them the resources to work with one another, because it doesn't matter ultimately whether it's an American scientist, a Chinese scientist, a French scientist, or someone else from somewhere else in the world who develops cures for diseases and who is able to develop a vaccination for a virus like this one. So we have to make sure that our foreign policy goals include promoting the health and safety and stability of other nations. Promoting their well-being, I believe, is essential to promoting our own national security and our well-being. And that's why I chose the subcommittee that I'm on in Foreign Affairs. The full name of it is the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, International Human Rights, and International Organizations. I very much believe that our future is dependent on making sure that other countries are supported, and that because they in turn will support us. And by support, I'm talking about providing resources, providing the outcome of their clinical trials, and sharing that kind of information with us. So I want to make sure that that we are doing that, and I will always support funding increases for global public health funding for the reasons I've just said.
We're very glad you chose that subcommittee too, and I know your constituents are as well. And you touched on a couple important impacts of our spending abroad on these programs. One is the development side, of course, to build capacity to combat the pandemic and other infectious diseases. There's another diplomatic part of this as well, as you talked about the sharing of intelligence, of finding a cure, of all that work on the diplomatic side. We're going to need to harness all the brain power and governmental know-how and to be able to attack this at home and abroad. So that's been part of our message here at USGLC as well, is that we've been making the case that as long as the deadly virus is anywhere, Americans are at risk given how quickly it spreads and can rebound back to our shore. We wanted to understand voters' attitudes about America's role in fighting COVID-19 everywhere. So we conducted a poll, and we're going to use the webinar poll function to ask you a question about the results of our poll. And you can see it there for our audience to interact with us. I want to read you we conducted a poll and we asked, and we found out what percentage of voters think that as long as coronavirus is spreading anywhere in the world, we won't be safe from new outbreaks here in the United States. So you have 4 choices for the percentage of voters who thought that. 15% of America's voters, 35%, 50%, or 77%. So on your screen, why don't you select which one you thought American voters thought about this?
And you're asking the audience to do that.
Asking the audience, that's right,
Yeah.
yes, Congresswoman. And we'll get the results in a moment too.
I love these polls that happen while we're.
Yep, right now we see.
Yeah.
And the actual answer is the one that was voted on by the most of your constituents too, Congresswoman. It's 77% of the American people believe that if it's coronavirus anywhere, we're not safe anywhere here. And I think that this is showing that your constituents, that American voters, understand that diseases don't recognize borders, and if we can't ignore the rest of the world. And as a matter of fact, this poll that we took nationally, there was overwhelming support across the political spectrum among all parties. So let me turn the question back to you. Given this overwhelming support from the American public for combating COVID-19 around the world, what more should we be doing, the U.S., to lead in this global response to keep us safe at home?
So I think that it's not just a matter of thinking about it in the context of a global pandemic. I think it's really important for us to think about in terms of global cooperation on all fronts, whether it be on climate change, whether it be on national security issues and the fight against terrorism. The more that we are working with other countries and showing our willingness to work with them, the more we are going to receive support from them when we face our own crises. There is no reason to expect that pandemics or epidemics will always start in some faraway country. We could very well, next time around, be the first hotspot. And then we are going to need to be ready to rush a response. And so not only do we need to be prepared here within our own borders, but we may very well need other advanced countries to join us if we happen to be the first hotspot for an epidemic. And so I can't stress enough how important I think it is that we develop mutual cooperation, particularly with democratic countries that have the same values that we do, and that we not adopt isolationist policies that essentially tell the rest of the world that we don't care about them. And unfortunately, that may at some point lead to them saying to us, well, we don't care about you either. And I think that we can't really underestimate that, how important that is.
I mean, you bring up an argument that COVID-19 is a template for how we need to re-energize, reclaim this cooperative idea and through our alliances and around the world for this virus, but future viruses, other challenges we have. It's what you're talking. If one emerged here, it's a reminder that, of course, NATO, one of our greatest political military alliances, the mutual defense provision of NATO was activated for the first time after 9/11. So the U.S. that led and built this alliance, it was actually, we asked our allies to come with us and work with us to respond to the 9/11 attacks. It's a kind of future you're talking about where the next pandemic doesn't emerge abroad, but here, and we're going to need to call on all the resources around the world to help us combat it.
Exactly. And 9/11 is a wonderful example. Not a pandemic, but an act of terrorism, multiple acts of terrorism that affected us so deeply. And our allies were there with us to help us, and to this day are. So I think that that's really just so important to stress, that we never know what the next critical moment might be.
That's a great segue into the next section we want to talk about, which is national security. And our top retired military leaders who serve on our National Security Advisory Council at USGLC made a public statement weeks ago that said, no matter how successful we are in fighting the threat of COVID-19 pandemic at home, we will never stop it unless we're also fighting it around the world. So let's turn back to the audience, to your constituents again, for another poll to see what the impacts on national security are. And we have figures from the International Rescue Committee, one of the world's top NGOs, and they released a report showing up to how many people in the world's 34 most conflict-affected and fragile states are at risk of contracting COVID-19. So in the most conflict and affected and fragile states, how many are at risk of contracting COVID-19? You can make your selection on the screen. Is it 100 million across the world, 500 million, or 1 billion? You make your selections now and we'll show the results in a moment. This one actually is even worse than what your constituents thought, although it was close. It's actually 1 billion was the report showing there. Just a staggering figure of the potential impact that threatens to destabilize many regions around the world. So with that figure of 1 billion at risk right now of COVID in the most fragile societies globally, Congresswoman, increased fragility could have serious repercussions for our own safety at home. And I would just give one example of that. The US military recently warned that the spread of COVID-19 could lead to a resurgence of ISIS in Syria, just one example. You've traveled to the Middle East at the end of last year. You saw firsthand the challenges that many fragile states in the region face. How worried are you about the destabilizing nature of this pandemic, and how can our strategic investments in development, diplomacy, global health help prevent these new threats from emerging and causing any further destabilization?
So I incorporated some comments about this in my opening remarks previously. I'm very concerned about the destabilizing nature of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are seeing, and I gave several examples of different countries, the potential for bad actors to exploit the emergency to consolidate their power in a very undemocratic manner. And it's very deeply concerning to me. This is a real problem for us as well as for what's happening in those countries, because as we destabilize them, or as they are destabilized by the pandemic, I should say, and as their leaders, who often are bad actors, exploit the people of those countries, we are at greater risk from a national security point of view. And that's why you're seeing military leaders such as those who are on your board talking about this issue and how important it is. And you know, when we lose democracies, when countries consolidate their power in a handful of bad actors, the potential for terrorist organizations to grow exists. The ability to take women and girls and any form of democratic governance out of the picture is increased. But we can help. We can use our strategic investments in global development, in diplomacy, in global public health to help prevent this stabilization of foreign nations and the democratic backsliding in countries around the world. If democracy is our ultimate goal, it's very important for us to recognize the threats to democracy when these kinds of actions exist. And you mentioned that I, at the end of last year, took a trip to the Middle East. I was with 5 or 6 of my colleagues, a bipartisan trip over the Christmas holiday. The main purpose was to go visit our troops on these different bases and bring them good wishes for the holiday season. It was a wonderful experience, and I honestly think that every member of Congress at some point should go visit troops abroad. But what I saw, in addition to our own troops and how hard they were working, separated from their families in most cases, patrolling fragile areas of the world that are so essential to our national security, right alongside them, I met French troops, Spanish troops, Italian troops, all working with our US troops on our air bases. I distinctly remember serving lunch, Christmas lunch on Christmas Day, and having a whole bunch of French airmen coming through the line and serving them. And it just struck me for the first time, really, that they were there working with us hand in hand to stabilize that region of the world. And then after returning to the States, within, I think it was about 3 days later, that the drone attack on General Soleimani happened. And we were all hearing in the news that our Middle East troops were all being deployed to places unknown. And I was thinking of our troops, but I was also thinking about those European troops who were there with us, and wondering where all of them had scattered. So I just think we have to recognize when we think about our military, and by the way, I think we take our military presence throughout the world very much for granted. And perhaps that's one of those things we should be able to take for granted. Just as we take our firemen and our policemen and EMS personnel for granted until we actually need them. It's the same thing with our military personnel. And I'm not suggesting that every single day they have to be top of mind for everybody. It would be nice if they were, but they're not. But we owe it to them to engage in a very calculated foreign policy that respects our allies and engages in strategic conflict negotiation with our adversaries.
You saw up close and personal the sacrifice, the commitment that our men and women serving in our armed forces make on our behalf around the globe. And it's a message that we in this coalition, our military leaders, our civilian leaders make as well, that addressing these crises abroad, whether it's global health, whether it's refugees, whether it's economic instability, security reasons, everything we do is to try and solve issues so we don't have to deploy as frequently. And when we do deploy, they don't have to stay there as long as possible because they are so precious to us and they do so much. And it's really, that security part is in this current pandemic and how we engage is so critical to our security at home. Let's move to economics as well, another important facet of this pandemic. We're seeing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, basically now. 33 million unemployed at home. IMF's predicting economic decline of 3% at least globally this year. We know Pennsylvania has strong global ties, and we know many who joined us today export overseas, do business abroad. This is something that's very sensitive to them too. But COVID-19's upended business as usual. In addition to the health of Pennsylvanians, COVID-19's taken a toll on the economy. So the question for your constituents today is, for a poll, how much do experts predict that global trade will be reduced this year alone? Three choices here. Global trade reduced by 33%, 10%, 25% at a minimum this year. Make your choices and we'll see the correct answer in a moment. They got it right again, 33%. It's that serious. And I mean, these are floors right now they're looking at, but we see everywhere where this pandemic is affecting economic life here and abroad. Our economy depends on global engagement. And in Pennsylvania, over 1.5 million jobs supported by international exports.
Right.
In addition to the grave concerns you have about our economic future at home, tell us about the ripple effects from the economic downturn that would happen in emerging markets in the developing world. I mean, as we are going to come out of this economic recovery, we've got to be exporting around the world too to help boost that economy. Pennsylvania's agriculture, manufacturing, pharmaceutical products, all of that. But if we're seeing a downturn in the rest of the world, that's going to have an effect on our ability to recover economically as well.
Well, I will tell you, before COVID started, when I was home in my district and not in Washington, I spent many, many hours touring the manufacturing facilities that exist here in Pennsylvania 7. And which is, by the way, for those who don't know, the Lehigh Valley, the greater Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania. We have a lot of manufacturers here. We manufacture everything from medical devices, essential medical equipment, to heavy machinery, computer chips, all kinds of things. And so honestly, I didn't come out of the manufacturing world. So it's really been very educational for me to spend time in these manufacturing facilities and to talk to the people, not just at the CEOs and at the executive level, but people all the way, onto the manufacturing floor. And what I quickly realized is how dependent we are on international trade. And right now, I'm just going to focus on my own district because I know, as you mentioned before, in Pennsylvania, 1.5 million jobs are supported by international trade. Not only do we export to international markets, but our supply chains are very tied up in international markets. So, before this all started, a lot of my focus was on things like tariffs and trade issues generally, and even immigration issues as it related to making sure that we were able to get international students to Lehigh University and some of the other schools in my district, where many of them are trained to become engineers and stay in this area in the manufacturing facilities. So I am worried. Obviously, I'm worried about the economy generally in our country and in my district, but I'm also worried about the global international economy and how we are going to reset it. Not just when this is all over, because we don't know when this is all going to be all over. The question is, how do we start resetting it now? And part of that is, again, to come back to sort of my theme here, is the global relationships that we have with countries around the world. We know, for instance, that when it comes to the manufacture of PPE, the masks and the other the facial shields and even the gowns and gloves that were so necessary for the hospital personnel and nursing home personnel to have, and still are necessary. One of the things that we suffered from in the early stages of this is that most of our supplies along those lines came from global markets, whether it be China or elsewhere. So these economic challenges can affect us both in the immediate sense when we're in a pandemic or an epidemic, but it's also a long-term issue. The developing countries that were already financially unstable and have many citizens with low levels of income, nonetheless, were in many cases our suppliers for certain parts or goods that turned out to be essential during this. So as more people's health and finances are hurt by this pandemic, I believe there's a greater likelihood of unrest, protests, political turmoil in countries around the world. And that, of course, is going to affect the economies of those countries and ultimately the economy of this country. So when we see economic downturns here, we know that the people who were already and I'm talking about here in the United States, people who were already economically disadvantaged become more economically disadvantaged. The example that's often given is that, the people who are doing just fine right now are the people who are able to telework, often white collar office jobs for the most part. The people who were the most economically disadvantaged, the people working at the low end of the wage scale, are the ones that are hurting the most right now. And the same thing goes in other countries. The more disadvantaged somebody is, the more they are going to be affected by a humanitarian crisis like this one. So we have to provide this kind of humanitarian assistance here and abroad. We need to make sure that people who don't have access to education and good jobs are helped in a humanitarian kind of way. We need to make sure that women and girls and people of minority ethnic and religious groups who are most likely to face obstacles when trying to access healthcare and stable employment, that those are exactly the communities that we are reaching out to and that we are assisting with. We've seen with previous public health emergencies like Ebola and the Zika virus, which I know, those names are known to everybody in this audience. It's hard to believe that we're now in the middle of a pandemic that actually eclipses those two. But those two viruses had tremendous and long-term impact on people's livelihoods and countries' financial stability. And as I've said before, instability is a national security issue as well as being a humanitarian issue. So I think we really need to pay close attention to those developing countries and how they are faring during these times.
So true, for a myriad of reasons, as you've laid out, both in your opening statement and just now. Let's hear from your constituents right now, some of the questions they have. And just as a reminder, if you have a question, hit the raise hand feature on the Zoom platform to be recognized. If you're joining us by phone, hit *9, or we can go to the Q&A function if you want to type in your questions too. So let's go to one that we had earlier from Eliz Nestorov of the U.S. Bulgarian Chamber, believing that our transatlantic connections and partnerships help make our country strong. But would you elaborate on why it's so critical that we are coordinating with allies overseas? You talked about this a lot, but address the pandemic, not only protect those most vulnerable, but our own citizens. So again, back to this idea of alliances and coordinating with allies overseas. You talked about it, but I think it's so critical that there's even more we could say on that.
Well, first of all, aside from the fact that I think it's the right thing to do, there is an inherent advantage to us in doing that. That advantage can be economic, it can be military, it can be scientists and healthcare workers. In addition to going to the Middle East over Christmas, in August of last year, I went to Germany with a very small working group. And my main reason for going was to study their approach to manufacturing. At that time, my biggest concern in my district for manufacturers was the inability to find workforce, because we actually were at a point just a few months ago of record employment and record low unemployment. And every manufacturer I visited talked about how they were having trouble filling key positions. And these were good paying jobs. And so, I felt as though we were literally leaving GDP on the table by not being able to fill these positions. So that was the stated purpose of going to Germany, to really understand how they approach the manufacturing world. And it is considerably different than ours, but I don't want to get too far afield. But my point is, and by the way, we were so well received. It was actually a group of 4 Republicans and me. Good. And then late in the trip, one other Democratic member joined us, Ted Deutsch, who's also in Foreign Affairs. But the idea was that we could learn from them. We could take their experiences back and help our country and help us develop workforce in the manufacturing world. So I use that as just a simple example, because there was no emergency going on. Although our manufacturers were unhappy with the fact that they couldn't fill these key positions, I wouldn't put it in the emergency category. Mm-hmm. So that's a non-emergent example of how important our relationships are, that we can actually learn from each other, and that we have this open relationship so that people want that they feel an urge to cooperate with us because we have cooperated with them. And the same thing goes when you're talking about health issues, when you're talking about national security issues. You, Jason, used the example of 9/11 before. That was a time when the help that we got from other countries was vital to us. If you remember the Australia fires that were, I guess, just last year, I mean, everything seems to be happening in such rapid succession, it's almost hard to keep up. But if you recall, we sent firefighters from the United States, and other countries sent firefighters to Australia to help that country deal with those fires. That's the kind of cooperation we need to be seeing in every area, not just when we have critical emergencies, but also when we need to be forward thinking. We need to think about how our economy is dependent on this kind of cooperation, how our national security and our health is dependent.
And how people remember that help too. I mean, you brought
100%.
The wildfires seem like a lifetime. There's a few months ago, it seems like a lifetime ago when that happened. We can go back to the tsunami in Indonesia years ago, U.S. sent huge help to help the people of Indonesia recover from that tsunami. Right after 9/11, there was an inverse relationship in U.S. public opinion. It inverted basically in a weeks afterwards, where we were underwater with the Indonesian people. We sent that assistance, and it flipped in a matter of a couple of weeks of seeing us again of the best of our values out there, whether it's sending firefighters or helping Haiti with the earthquake or Indonesia in the tsunami, those, or people sending us help after 9/11. People they don't forget that for a long time about that.
That's
And that's
right.
where the alliances become human.
And honestly, when I was in Germany, the clear message our very small group got was how happy they were that we were there and that we cared. And by the way, while I was there, I independently, without the other members, went and visited Heidelberg Cement because they have a branch here in my district. And what I was most interested in learning about was their approach to climate change, because we know that the cement industry is one of the greatest emitters of carbon. But Heidelberg Cement has been very proactive in regulating themselves, not waiting for government regulation. And so it's that kind of learning that we can do across our borders that is just, and we know, as I said at the very beginning, we never know when the next emergency will happen and we will need people.
So true. We have Gary Smith, one of your constituents, I think. We're going to turn on his microphone. And Gary, go ahead and ask a question to the Congresswoman.
Yes, good afternoon.
There we
Thank
go.
you very much. My name's Gary Smith. I serve as the president and CEO of the Chester County Economic Development Council here in Pennsylvania. I had a question for you, Congresswoman. I know in regards to the comments we've been talking about regarding international trade and the like, 20% of our businesses are connected, obviously, with the international marketplace today. This terrible pandemic has hit our country, our communities as well. It's affected, obviously, the economic health of so many businesses. And there's relationships that our business community has had with international companies. We have a strong international organization that has been working aggressively for years in developing international trade and opportunities for our Chester County business community. They are very fragile, and under the pandemic that we're all living with, and I know Congress will be looking at new legislation as we look at maybe phase 4 and other things that are happening here in our domestic land. What can we do to make sure that those business relationships that we have established abroad will be continued to be nurtured and grown as we come out of this recovery?
Well, I think it goes back to the things that I talked about earlier in terms of making sure that we are using our resources to support other countries and their efforts, and the global cooperation. As you were speaking, it reminded me of stories that I heard from manufacturers in my district about their the amount of trade that they were engaged in with foreign companies, and how vital it was, both in the supply chain and in terms of the finished product being exported. So I think that it's one of the reasons that I was so interested in the Foreign Affairs Committee. As I mentioned, the subcommittee that I'm on, the first word in the name of the subcommittee is Africa. Africa happens to be a continent where we have, in many ways, ceded the CEDED, the development of that country to China, and we're behind. We are frankly behind. So that China has established relationships in Africa starting long ago that we did not until more recently, and that will be both an outlet for future exports by us, but also a huge part of the supply chain. We know that their minerals are vital to many of the electronic products that we develop nowadays. And so that's what I mean by forward thinking. You know, a lot of times people hear that I'm on the Africa subcommittee, as the short name for it. And they wonder, you know, what does that have to do with Pennsylvania 7? And I explained to them that one of my greatest interests is, aside from global health, and it often our universal global health is often affected by what's going on in Africa in terms of health. But aside from that, I have really strong interest in the trade aspects of Africa. I think that there is a lot of potential there for us, and and that we really need to work on that. And I don't mean exploit African countries. I'm talking about working side by side with them, employing African workers, which is, by the way, one of the mistakes that the Chinese government did in the beginning. They brought in only Chinese workers, didn't really help the local African economies. I would suggest that we would want to do it differently. And it's not just Africa. There are countries like the countries of Africa around the world where we could develop those relationships. One of the things that was really striking to me when I was on this Middle East trip, we visited a naval base where one of the things that was explained to us is that we are behind in developing ports around the world. And those ports have also been developed by China. They have relationships. They've got ports that, you know, will be used obviously for international trade. We're really lagging behind. So again, I don't think we can think of ourselves in an isolationist kind of way. If we want to continue, and let's for the moment put aside health and national security and just talk about economic prosperity,
Right.
The good times, that will also be just as dependent on international trade as national security and health will be.
I mean,
And
the China
Go
question
ahead.
you bring up is so important too. I mean, as you said, before all of this COVID hit, their investments were outstripping us in Africa, Latin America, the developing world, at a scale 6 to 1 of what we were spending in the Marshall Plan in real terms. They were making these investments not by sending their military out, but by creating these economic links, complex and fraught, as you said. And in the midst of doing everything else right now, there's if we're not a leader in trying to solve COVID-19 abroad, the Chinese, where the virus emerged from, have also been out there in a very public way in trying to provide assistance to countries who are going to deal with this in fragile systems. That's the cost of leadership. I mean, that is trying to be there for folks to remember that at their time of crises, of who is going to be this global leader out there.
Exactly. And I honestly believe that developing countries around the world want to work with the United States,
very much so.
that we would be a desired partner, and would probably have a trade advantage with them if we showed that inclination of helping their people.
Yeah. And we got time for one more question, then your close, if that's okay. And I have John Simon also there's coming up in the queue, I think. If we can unmute him, and John, ask your question to the Congresswoman, please.
Sure. First, I want to thank you very much for your comments today. I'm proud to have you representing me in Washington, D.C. I think education and global leadership go hand in hand. And another economic impact of the coronavirus is a drastic decline in global travel, as well as a decline in international students coming to the United States and Pennsylvania in particular. As you know, your home state has 51,000 or so international students, and it contributes about $2 billion to the state economy. And I think it's important that we don't lose that, and we don't lose it across the country as well. And so I'm just curious in your thoughts about how we encourage international students to continue studying in the US and in Pennsylvania in particular, both during and after the pandemic ends.
Congresswoman Bill Gaudelli, also Lehigh University, had a similar question in the chat room. This idea of, you talked about it earlier, people don't think of our universities as exports, but they're exporting. We're getting revenue back into this country because foreign students come to this country under normal circumstances. International students, they pay fees, they spend in our local communities. I mean, that's a huge economic driver also.
Right. And I don't know whether that John Simon was the John Simon of Lehigh University. I suspect perhaps it was. So hello, John. Good to hear from you. In any event, so Pennsylvania 7, my district, has many really fine colleges and universities. Lehigh is just one of them. We have Lafayette College, Muhlenberg College, DeSales College. We have 2 of the state's 14 community colleges are in this district. And the community colleges, by and large, are appealing to first-generation college students who are local. But the 4-year schools, you're absolutely right. the education that they can provide has in the past been an export of this country. And not only an export of this country in terms of dollars, but it's also, we have gained a lot of knowledge and information and research from these international students. When I went up to Lehigh University and visited their labs, I was struck by their laboratories. I was struck by the number of international students that I met who were working there as research scientists. Many of them will stay here in the United States. One of the problems that has been expressed to me by university administrations across my district is the decreasing number of international students. First of all, for the viability of our higher institutions of higher learning, international students are very important. They form a sizable percentage of their undergraduate, but even more importantly, their graduate programs. And the fact that those numbers are declining is of substantial concern to me, especially when we are facing, and then certainly over the next decade, a decline in the birth rate, which will ultimately really hurt our colleges and universities that we are very dependent on, not just for educating our youth, but also for the science and technology that it is turned out by those schools. So I think that, and that's a long way start to the ultimate answer to this question, which is, I think we have to be looking at comprehensive immigration reform. Right now, I'm not talking about our southern border. I'm not talking about issues having to do with ICE or anything else. I am talking about how we develop an immigration policy that is fair to those students, that doesn't create so much red tape that they no longer want to be here, or that is a disincentive for them to come study because they are being told that they won't be able to remain after they finish, which of course is a terrible brain drain that we don't want to see. So I think we need to approach immigration from the top down. We need to be thinking about all the valuable ways that immigration and constructive, strong immigration policies help our economy and help our collective brain trust. Again, I hate to keep coming back to China, but my understanding is that China has developed colleges and universities at a rapid pace that are competing with our institutions of higher learning. And I don't want to see that. As somebody who is the representative from a district with 6 or 7 colleges and universities, that's devastating to me that we are losing those students. So, and I also, by the way, just to circle back to the comments we've made earlier, yeah, I think that's yet another way that we create a global climate. Somebody who studies here but ultimately goes back to his or her own country may very well turn out to be that person in government or in industry who works with us in the future, right, and who has fond memories of being here in the Lehigh Valley and studying here and wants to advance that global relationship. So I think it's a really important topic, and it has to be addressed by way of the frank and honest discussion of the importance of that type of immigration.
That citizen diplomacy that our universities conduct, and that
Absolutely.
Students of today are the leaders we call upon in crisis in the future, who go back home and rise up the ranks and and have an impression forged by studying in the Lehigh Valley, this time, and that forges an idea of an America that that they want to be a part of and work with in the future. Right. We're drawing to the close of our time. We've had a lot of heavy conversations today and some challenges at home and abroad, but let's try and end on a positive and an optimistic note. And you touched on some of those points earlier, but in this China challenge, what gives you hope right now to stopping this COVID-19 in its tracks abroad and at home, getting on the road to economic recovery, and providing hope to Americans that we're going to get through this at an uncertain time? What gives you hope these days as we face this?
I'll tell you what gives me hope. We are all human beings, ultimately, no matter what our nationality, ethnicity, religion is. We're all human beings. So in that sense, we have a very strong common interest of living, and living as well as possible. And what it gives me a lot of hope is the kind of coming together that I have seen from individuals around, even as governments are struggling and politicians are often divisive. The kind of coming together that I am seeing from human beings, citizens here, presumably elsewhere. Obviously, I haven't traveled during this period of time. I think is where we in government and in leadership need to really take our instruction. We need to look at what ordinary human beings, our citizens, are doing for each other, and take our cues from them. And I think that when we do that, we all come out of this in a much healthier, happier position.
That is a positive note to end on. And I am positive that your constituents who joined you for this great hour see how fortunate they are to have you representing them on Capitol Hill. Your command of domestic policy, of foreign policy, national security, addressing all issues of this pandemic were crystal clear over this hour. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you. Continue to do great work. Thank you for joining us today. It means so much. I'm going to turn to close up our program today with my colleague, Elizabeth Hayskamp, USGLC's Northeast Outreach Director. And there's Elizabeth coming up right now to bid us farewell. Thank you so much again, Congresswoman. It is outstanding to talk with you today.
My pleasure, and anytime. I would love to join you.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Well, thank you so much, Jason and Congresswoman Wild, for this engaging conversation during these critical times and for your unwavering support for America's global leadership. I'm so appreciative of all of you that are slowly dropping off that joined us today for this conversation, and to thank Representative Wild, including our wonderful Pennsylvania Advisory Committee members and our Veterans for Smart Power. Thanking your congressperson and sharing your position is critical to keeping the United States leadership around the globe strong, so that we protect our economic interests, our national security priorities, and our humanitarian values. So when your congressperson, such as Congresswoman Wild, speak out or take action to continue supporting America's development and diplomacy programs, please say thank you. They definitely don't hear it enough, and your voice will continue to matter and make a difference. Here at the USGLC, we're trying to regularly update you on what's happening in Pennsylvania, around the country, and around the world. You all should have seen and received a couple updates over the past few weeks, and if you haven't, please follow up with me afterwards to make sure that you're on our mailing list. And for more up-to-the-minute information, please follow our Twitter. Thank you all again for your support and voice during these difficult times. I enjoy hearing from all of you and look forward to continuing these conversations with each one of you. So all, please be well, stay safe, and have a great Thursday. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Congresswoman.